This is A View from the Bunker. Now, here's Derek Gilbert.
Tombs of the Giants. Welcome to A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. Before we jump into this week's program with a guest I know you're going to want to hear from, please take a moment. If you are watching on YouTube, God bless you. Subscribe, share, and then protect yourself from us being canceled by downloading our free app. It's available for iOS, Android, and Amazon Kindle Fire phones and tablets. You can also get it for Roku and Apple TV devices. But by doing so, since this is our app, which is developed and hosted by a Christian company, if we happen to say something on one of these programs that violates community standards, even though we don't tend to, we may even be saying something that is demonstrably and evidentially true. Doesn't matter. Their sandbox, their rules. Please get our app, gilberthouse.org/app, gilberthouse.org/app. You can also find it at our website, VFTB.net. Now, back in 2018, we were invited to accompany our guest this week on a special trip, an expedition, if you will, to the island of Sardinia, one of the most mysterious places on the planet, even though it's kind of overlooked when it comes to these weird sites. It's not as famous as, say, the Bermuda Triangle or places like that, and yet there are more than 200 sites designated giants' tombs on the island. There also happens to be a Mesopotamian-style ziggurat on the island, which is not supposed to exist in the Western Mediterranean. So, because he invited Sharon and me to accompany him on this tour, we're going to talk about that this week. We are returning the favor on our 2024 Israel tour, a place he's never been, and taking him and you, if you join us, to some of our megalithic sites, or some of the megalithic sites we have been blessed to visit in Israel. We'll talk about that at the end of the program. But now, joining us, the author of the best-selling book, Birthright, the closest thing to a modern-day Indiana Jones in my circle of friends. We are honored to welcome back to the program Timothy Alberino. Tim, welcome back to the program. It's been too long since we've had you on. Last time we talked to you was when we had you on that short-lived Bible's Greatest Mysteries program, talking about the
yes.
Birthright. But this conversation will focus more on what we did 5 years ago on the island of Sardinia and the connections that exist. I think archaeologically speaking, it's pretty clear between Sardinia and ancient Canaan. Were you surprised to find out that there is some archaeological evidence, some good archaeological evidence that connects the giants' tombs of Sardinia, that culture, the Nuragic civilization, to the time of, say, Joshua and the judges in ancient Canaan?
Well, I think I'm more delighted than surprised. It's kind of expected. After being in Sardinia and doing some research. I've been to Sardinia a few times actually, and done a lot of research regarding the Nuragic civilization, the Bronze Age civilization that inhabited that island, very mysterious civilization, and have agreed. I concur with some of the older studies that have been done on the island by different individuals who have concluded that the Nuragic culture, the Nuragic civilization, is Canaanitish. That it looks like a direct transplant from the land of Canaan. And so, no, I'm not surprised. I'm delighted, and I'm looking very much forward to joining you in Israel and actually getting close to some of these sites that I think represent direct connections.
The one site that's most directly linked is the site called El Ahwat, which is definitely not on the tours like a lot of the places that we'll see, like Gilgal Rephaim, a couple of the other megalithic sites we hope to visit. We're working with Lipkin Tours right now to see if we can go to these sites similar to Gilgal Rephaim called Herbet Bateha, which overlooks the Jordan River just a couple miles north of the Sea of Galilee. But El Ahwat was found just about 30 years ago by the archaeologist Adam Zertal, who also found Joshua's altar on Mount Ebal. This in terms of the architecture, is not like the typical three-room house, a rectangular three-room house that they find, or four-room house that's typical of Israel and Canaan back in the day, but it's got the round construction that is typical of the Nuragic civilization on Sardinia. Right. And it took an Italian archaeologist visiting Israel to show Zertal Yeah, we know exactly what this is. Come to Sardinia and we'll show you where these things are, which really points to a connection between the general who led the army for the Canaanite king of Hatzor against the Israelites.
Well, that's remarkable. And you're referring to the Nuragic, the megalithic stone towers in Sardinia, and the Sardinians are under the impression that these towers are unique to Sardinia. They're unique to that island, when in fact, apparently, it looks like there's towers in Canaan that predate the ones or at least are contemporary with the ones in Sardinia. So that to me is as I said, it's remarkable. And the link between Sardinia and Canaan, it seems to be becoming stronger and stronger with each new archaeological find.
What was it about Canaan, or rather about Sardinia, that drew your attention and made you want to go there in the first place?
I was contacted some years ago while I was working with Steve Quayle. I was contacted by a woman named Anna Tuberi, and shout out to Anna Tuberi if she's watching this interview. Anna had she's Italian. I believe, and forgive me, Anna, if I get this wrong, is from Rome, and had relatives, I believe, in Sardinia, or is part Sardinian. I can't remember all the details, but Anna contacted me and drew my attention to Sardinia as it relates to giants. And so I made a preliminary journey to Sardinia with my friend Darren Geisinger. And Darren and Anna and myself, we traveled around the island with a gentleman named Luigi Muscas. And that was the first time that I set eyes on the Nuragic towers and put my hands on the tombs of the giants and began to understand that there was something tremendously significant about Sardinia, indeed uniquely significant about Sardinia, especially as it relates to the land of Canaan, as we've discussed.
What's the connection between the giants of Sardinia and the Rephaim of Canaan, do you think?
Well, I suppose we should lay a foundation in regard to the Nuragic civilization. We keep talking about the Nuragic, which are the towers, which were built by the Nuragic civilization, which is believed to have existed from about the 18th century BC until the time of the Romans. It is the Nuragic civilization is a Canaanitic culture. It certainly had Phoenician influences and later Carthaginian influences. Now, the Phoenicians and the Carthaginians, who are they? Well, they're basically the Canaanites. They're derivative of the Canaanites.
Right.
And I've got some notes here regarding, I made a film. Most of my audience is probably familiar with this film. I'm in the True Legend series called Holocaust of Giants. Tom Horn was in the film, Steve Quayle, myself. And we were in Sardinia. The latter part of the film or the second half of the film features Sardinia. And during the investigations for the film, I came across two individuals who had done extensive investigations, separate investigations into the Nuragic culture in the mid-1800s. And these were two academics. One of the gentlemen was named Antonio Bresciani, who was a Jesuit scholar. The other, his name was John Tyndale, and he was an Oxford-educated lawyer. And they studied the Nuragic towers. They studied the tombs of the giants. They studied the cultural traditions of the Sardinian people. And what's interesting is that they both drew the same conclusion, and that is that the Nuragic civilization was most likely founded by the Canaanites, who they believed had migrated to the island either before or during the conquest of Canaan by Joshua and the Israelites. And they both surmised that when the Canaanites landed, there were giants in their ranks. And in fact, I have a quote here from John Tyndale. He writes this in his book, The Island of Sardinia, published in 1849. if a Canaanitish race migrated here, nothing is more probable than that the tradition and worship of the giants would also be imported. Nay, it is even possible that some of the actual gigantic races of Rephaim, Anakim, Philistines, Emim, or Zamzumim might have actually arrived in Sardinia. And as I said, he based this conclusion off of his investigations into the Nuragic, the tombs of the giants, and the traditions of the Sardinians. Again, Antonio Bresciani, the Jesuit scholar, drew the exact same conclusion, and these were separate investigations. And so when I arrived to the island, in fact, I had not known about these gentlemen in their investigations. So when I returned, rather, from Sardinia and found out about these investigations, I was gladdened, reassured to find that these other men had drawn the very same conclusions that I had while in Sardinia, that this culture, the Nuragic civilization, is Canaanitish, that very clearly on this island, with all of these megalithic towers, there was a cult of giants, a Canaanitish cult of giants. And when I say all of these megalithic towers, presently there are 7,000 extant towers on the island of Sardinia, Nuragic towers, these stone megalithic towers. Now, I should say that although these towers are built in the Cyclopean style, i.e. without the use of mortar, they are inferior to, say, the walls of Sacsayhuaman in Peru, to some of the megalithic constructions in Egypt, to Baalbek, for example, to some of these constructions that I believe, at least the foundations of which, are antediluvian. But it's intriguing to me that there's one place in the world where I can say there are post-diluvian, in other words, post-flood megaliths built in the Cyclopean style, albeit cruder than the antediluvian. There's one place on earth where you can find an abundance of this, and it is precisely in Sardinia, and now maybe also in Israel, as you've been telling me some of the findings in Israel. And that is intriguing because at one time, there were over 30,000 Nuragic megalithic towers on that one island. 30,000. And some of these towers stand over 100 feet tall. And there were 30,000 at one time. And the stones, as you well know, Derek, the stones incorporated into some of these towers are massive. And not to say nothing of the tombs of the giants. The towers themselves represent a tremendous amount of effort, the larger ones, a tremendous amount of effort to build these things and skill. So it's quite intriguing.
Especially when you consider that these were built without any kind of mortar. These were dry stacked stone, and yet they were able to come up with these towers as tall as a 10-story building, as you mentioned, but also with what looked like crenellated ramparts.
Yes.
Around some.
Yes.
Now, they don't still exist today, but we know from the models of the Nuragic that have been found at some of these sites that these things look like your typical, like the rook on the chessboard.
Exactly,
some of the
right.
castle, the castles.
Power.
Right. And they were doing this without any kind of mortar or cut stone. They were dry stacking stone.
That's right. And it should be noted that you mentioned this. There's a platform at the very top of these towers. There was a wooden platform that circumnavigates the tower at the top. And that platform was buttressed by these they're large stones, but the size isn't what's impressive about them. It's the fact that they're cut stones. I don't know if we saw any of these when you were with us in Sardinia, but there are cut stones, even though most of the stones that are incorporated into the towers are just crude, are just rough hewn. There are very finely cut stones, megalithic stones that buttress this tower at the top, rather this wooden platform at the top. And what's really amazing about these cut stones is these are basalt. These are volcanic basalt stones, very, very hard stone. And when you get up close to them, they're cut with precision. And so what that informs us is that whoever these people were, the Nuragic civilization, and again, I believe that they were, let's just simplify the term, let's call them Phoenicians. I mean, the Phoenicians, again, were derived from the Canaanites, so they're Canaanitish. these people were in possession of knowledge, in my estimation, from the pre-flood world as it pertains to the building of megaliths, because nowhere else in the world have I discovered so many post-flood megalithic constructions. And so it represents a civilization that still had the knowledge of how to build megaliths, although on a smaller scale and in an inferior way than their antecedents, namely the pre-flood civilization, the antediluvians.
Remarkable that, as you say, they were able to cut basalt, which is an extremely hard rock. During the Bronze Age, the late Bronze, the Iron Age really didn't begin until about the 15th, 14th century BC, depending on where you were in the world. And even then, trying to cut basalt with iron is a challenge. But this is the thing that really startled us when we saw Sardinia. The symbolism, for example, of the goddess Tanit is all over the island. The keyhole shape. Mm-hmm. Tanit is well known to archaeologists and historians to just be the Phoenician form of the older Canaanite goddess Asherah, who was the consort of the chief god of the Canaanites, El, who was Baal Haman to the Phoenicians. Even though the Phoenicians, according to the official history, weren't supposed to have arrived there until about the 9th century BC, the sacred wells in this keyhole shape, the symbol of Tanit, date back to about the 15th century BC.
Well, it's interesting. You talk about the sacred wells, and for those who have not seen the sacred wells, these are very impressive constructions. They're also megalithic. In fact, the hotel that we were staying at, you and Sharon accompanied me on the Gen 6 tour that we conducted in Sardinia, and the hotel we stayed in, the woman who owns the hotel actually had one of these sacred wells in her cellar.
Yeah, in the courtyard outside the window, just look down there. Oh, sacred well. Those are all over the island too.
The cellar and down under the cellar, she had one of these megalithic sacred wells. And her cellar, I mean, the sacred well was impressive, but her cellar was also impressive, as it was just loaded with salami and prosciutto and cheese and wine.
Yeah.
But what's very intriguing about the sacred well, and I didn't realize this while in Sardinia, I realized this later on after doing some more research on these sacred wells. For those who've never seen them, they are somewhat in the shape of a keyhole, but they're lined with megalithic stones, and those appear to be finely cut megalithic stones.
Yeah.
And it goes down into a well, so it's sort of it descends into this tunnel lined with stone down into a well. And it occurred to me later on, subsequent to our tour in Sardinia, that whereas they do look like a keyhole, and they also look conspicuously like something else, and I hesitate to say it.
It's
the private parts of a woman.
It's a fertility thing, yeah.
It's a fertility thing, which is really fascinating because that connects directly to the tombs of the giants. Mm-hmm. The tombs of the giants, I had assumed, and I think rightly so, but I only had part of the picture. The tombs of the giants in Sardinia, there's two kinds of tombs. There's the tombs that have the large stone stele and false door at the front, and so it's a little false door. It's like a little doggy door, basically, built into this tomb, and I could probably squeeze into it, but just barely, maybe not, but certainly like my sons could squeeze into it, and that was apparently the point. So you have this false doors, a large stone stele, carved stele, with a false door in it leading into a gallery. That's one kind of tomb. Then you have another kind of tomb on the island, and they're called the Tomb of the Giants. That's what they've been called since time immemorial in Sardinia. The second kind is, it has a megalithic trilithon doorway that leads into a gallery. So it's a little bit larger, but it's a megalithic trilithon with very large stones in most cases. Both of these tombs of the giants, both of these different designs were used for the same purpose. And the purpose of the tomb wasn't to inter the body of a giant. Rather, the tomb was built on top of the grave. And the tomb was used for what is called the rite of incubation in Sardinia. And the rite of incubation, this is an old, and they'll tell you in Phoenicia, I'd rather in Sardinia, that this is an old Phoenician tradition. So the rite of incubation is a rite of passage in which adolescents incubate in the gallery, in other words, within the tomb, to commune, in order to commune with the hero buried beneath. And so that was the purpose of the tombs of the giants. They were incubation chambers. And while I was in Sardinia doing my investigations, I had always assumed that the tombs of the giants, because both of those variants of the tombs are shaped the same. And that shape seemed to me to be a bull's head.
Yes. Because
it looks like the face of a bull with two horns. And I think it is, but I think that's only half of the puzzle here. I think it's intentionally shaped to look like a bull's head, but perhaps even more prominently like a uterus, like a womb, which makes a lot of sense if these are incubation, if these were designed for the rite of incubation. So young people, let's talk about the tomb that has the large stele with that little false door at the bottom. The reason why that doorway is so small, and the archaeologists there will say, oh, that's so that the soul of the dead person buried inside can escape, can leave the tomb and go into the afterlife. That's not what the doorway is for. The doorway isn't for something to come out. Rather, it's designed for somebody small to go in. And who is going into the tombs? The adolescents, the children. It was a rite of passage. So maybe 13, 14, 15-year-old kids, adolescents, teenagers, were crawling on their hands and knees into the tomb. And I'm sure that the tomb was sealed behind them. And inside of these tombs, in the trilithon tombs, at least, you have a little cubby hole to the side. I don't know if you recall this from one of the tombs we visited in Sardinia. There's like a little cubby area to the side with a little bench where you can sit and maybe light a candle or whatever. Inside of these galleries, they're rather large inside. These young, maybe one at a time, or maybe a group of adolescents would incubate. And some of the people in Sardinia, some of the historians and tour guides, they told me that they believe that these young people, these adolescents, would incubate for several days inside of the tomb, probably fasting. They probably went in with some water, and they would incubate for several days. And again, the point of this incubation was to commune with the Gibborim, with the Rephaim, the giant buried beneath. That's the tradition. That's the legend. And so you can imagine then that when these adolescents emerge from the tomb, they crawl out through that little false doorway at the bottom, or they come out of through the trilithon doors. Probably a large stone is rolled away on who knows how many days they were in there. They emerge. What does that represent? It represents a new birth, that they're emerging. They have emerged through the rite of passage as men. And so it's almost like a new birth, almost in the Christian sense, that they go in children and they come out men, having communed. But this is the important part: having communed with the spirits of the dead giants, the giants who were likely buried beneath the tombs.
There are other connections here to the ancient world. This is something I discovered in the research for my book, The Second Coming of Saturn, that a group of people called the Hurrians or the Horites in the Bible practiced a ritual where they would descend into a ritual pit, a necromantic ritual pit, and summon spirits from the underworld. This pit was called the Abi, A-B-I, and scholar back in the 1960s, named of Harry Hoffner, who was a Hittiteologist, argued from an etymological standpoint that word was actually the origin of the Sumerian word abzu, from which we get the Greek word abusos, the abyss, but also the origin of the Hebrew word ov, O-B, but pronounced ov, which is usually translated into English as medium, as in the Ov of Endor, the lady that Saul visited the night before the Philistines killed him and stuck him up on a wall. This idea of summoning spirits from the netherworld appears to be very ancient because archaeologists have traced the Hurrians, because of their unique pottery style, they've traced the Hurrians back to the middle of the 5th millennium BC to the Ararat Plain, interestingly enough, the plain below the mountain where the ark came to rest. So this shouldn't be a surprise to us that this practice in a variant form is on the island of Sardinia. And I'm looking at one of the images of one of the giants' graves, a Codu Vecchio, which is got one of those stela in the front with the little false door on the bottom. Mm-hmm. It is very definitely a phallic symbol on the front of that tomb. So I think you're right about the rebirth there. And I had not considered the shape being the female reproductive organ, but it does have that shape when you look from above. Again, most scholars will say, well, it has the shape of a bull's head. I would make the connection to Baal Haman, who to the Canaanites was known as Bull El, but also Kronos of the Greeks, whose name derives from the Semitic word keren, meaning horns. He is the horned one. Mm-hmm. So multiple layers of meaning here, but
yeah, I think there's dual symbolism at work in the tombs of the giants. I think it is a bull's head and a uterus, and I think those two things they connect in this idea of the rite of incubation.
But even
being
the bull,
being a Canaanitish rite,
sure. But even to the Canaanites, the bull had this sort of procreative idea. That was part of the idea with Bull El. In the Canaanite myths, he's described as being a rather randy old fellow. There's some Canaanite myths you wouldn't want to repeat to your children that involve El and his activities. Anyway, but this we see this even in Israel today, and we had the opportunity, and I'm hoping that we can get you and Jasmine for like a several-day pre-tour expedition next March, because we had the opportunity to meet with archaeologist Dr. Mike Freakman, who was very excited that there's somebody other than scholars who are actually reading his academic papers. Sharon and me, Doug Van Dorn, Janelle Van Dorn, and he was taking us around Gilgal Rephaim and the Serpent Mound of Bashan, and showing us where he excavated and what they did. It's like, yes, we know, we read your papers. He argues that the central core of Gilgal Rephaim and other sites like it, like Herbet Beteha, but many of the megalithic burial sites in ancient Canaan, and this would have been in ancient Bashan, predating the Nuragic civilization by about 2 millennia, were essentially artificial mountains, the central core surrounded by the concentric rings of stone, with that gallery tomb, the chamber where you'd go into the central core as sort of an artificial netherworld to go in and commune with the underworld spirits, or perhaps with whatever was buried underneath those megalithic funerary monuments. Mm-hmm. So this is a very, very ancient practice. I mean, this we're probably talking was like 4,000 or 5,000 years old by the time Jesus walked the earth.
Yes, and it is, and I believe it is directly related to the veneration of the Nephilim, of the giants. And there's actually some historical precedents for this. The Greek biographer Plutarch recorded that when the Roman general Quintus Sertorius took the town of Tinges, which is modern-day Tangier, he broke open the tomb of Ancaeus, the venerated Phoenician giant. And then Plutarch then describes the general's reaction with what he discovered inside, writes Plutarch. But great was his surprise when he beheld a body 60 cubits long. He immediately offered sacrifices and closed up the tomb, which added greatly to the respect and reputation it had before. So this signals, assuming that this is a true account, and I would say it is. I mean, it's, of course, these ancient biographers and these ancient historians were not ashamed to aggrandize the tales that they were telling. But let's say that I don't know how many feet 60 cubits long is.
90.
And that 90 feet. So let's say that he's just wildly exaggerating, and it was just 15 feet long or 20 feet long.
Or even 9.
Or even 9 feet long. That's right. Because many of the tombs of the giants in Sardinia seem to have been designed for 9 to 10 feet tall people. And also many of the stories, the anecdotal stories that we heard from people who've actually held the bones of the giants, dug them up, and so forth. It's usually between 9 and 10, sometimes up to 12 feet tall. That's the range that, in accordance with the testimonies that we heard in Sardinia. But back to this story by Plutarch. So let's just say that this was like a 9, 10 foot tall, even maybe up to 15 foot tall giant. The fact is that the Phoenicians were venerating this guy. I think very clearly the Phoenicians had a cult of, let's call it, Nephilim veneration. And what makes Plutarch's account even more fascinating is that near the town of Tingis, which is, by the way, located near the Straits of Gibraltar, right on the shore, actually, the Straits of Gibraltar, stone pillars had been erected by the Phoenicians, emblazoned with the inscription, "We are the Canaanites who fled before the face of Joshua the robber, the son of Nun." And so what you have here, when you combine these two stories, you have Plutarch's account of Quintus Sertorius, who opened the tomb of a giant that was being venerated by the Phoenicians, and then he venerated it himself. And then you have these pillars with the inscription, "We are the Canaanites who fled before the face of Joshua the robber, the son of Nun." And so when you put all these pieces together, the Nuragic-like structures in Israel, the megalithic tombs in Israel, the dolmens, which we haven't even really discussed yet, the dolmens, and then you look west to Sardinia, and you find like basically ground zero of all of that in Sardinia, just a preponderance of ancient megalithic tombs and towers and dolmens. I don't think there's anywhere in the world where there's such a collection of these things. And then you look further westward to the Straits of Gibraltar, and you see the Phoenicians there venerating a dead giant and writing this inscription on the pillars. Well, I think the clear picture that we have here is we have the Canaanitic races, which some of them were giants, or at least there were giants among them, like the Philistines. There was giants among regular-sized Philistines, obviously, according to the account of David and Goliath. And when Joshua was conquering Canaan, you had, obviously, he defeated the Canaanites. He conquered them. He vanquished them, and they fled. And there's reason to believe that a lot of these Canaanite tribes were seafaring people. Obviously, the Phoenicians, who were the master seafarers and masons of the ancient world. So they were driven westward. And when you're driven westward from Canaan, if you go west, due west through the Mediterranean Sea, down around Sicily, you find Sardinia. And Sardinia might have just provided the perfect environment where these fleeing Canaanites could land and occupy the island, or cohabitate the island with some other culture that was there previous to them. So, but I believe strongly that Sardinia became a Canaanite stronghold during and after the conquest of Canaan by Joshua and the Israelites. I strongly believe that. And then obviously later on, the Romans and the Carthaginians at various times occupied the island. So if that's true, that Sardinia was indeed a Canaanite stronghold, which means it was loaded with giants, then there could potentially be hundreds, if not thousands, of Nephilim corpses buried in that soil.
Well, that was one of the things that we found most fascinating about your film, Holocaust of Giants, the testimony of Luigi, who you mentioned earlier, who claims that he saw representatives of the Vatican arriving to take away some of these very large sets of remains that have been discovered by people on the island and, taken away to Vatican archives, presumably, but never seen again.
Yeah, we interviewed Luigi, and we interviewed half a dozen people in that film, because basically Sardinia in recent history in some ways serves as a comparative case study to the United States at the turn of the 20th century, when the Smithsonian institution was exhuming and concealing the bones of giants from Indian mounds and earthworks, which once populated the landscape in the Midwest. So that scenario, which many people are familiar with here in America, the Smithsonian cover-up, that happened back at the turn of the 20th century, whereas in Sardinia, just in recent history, after World War II, in the era after World War II, they were still digging up the bones of giants, burning them in the village in some cases, carrying them off. They were employing, we talked to several individuals, at least two individuals, who were both employed at the same archaeological dig at the Church of Anastasia in Sardinia. And the Church of Anastasia, like so many churches and cathedrals around the world, was built on top of the ruins of the Nuragic civilization. And so the municipality, struggling to say that word for a minute, the municipality employed these two guys and others to go into the ruins beneath and in front of the church. I've been to Anastasia. I don't know if we went. I think we went. Did we not go to the Church of?
Is that the one with
Anastasia?
The really strange carvings around the?
No, that's San Pantaleo.
Okay,
in Golianova. That's a very interesting place too, which is also built on top of a necropolis. But Santa Anastasia is, as I said, built on top of Nuragic ruins. And these individuals who we interviewed were employed to go down into the ruins and to basically to look for artifacts and extract the artifacts. And they would take the artifacts, and the procedure was they placed the artifacts in the church. They had a bunch of tables erected all over the place inside of the church, and then they would place the artifacts on the tables, and then somebody would come during the night and take all the artifacts away. And then they would come in the following morning, same procedure, except there would be no artifacts in the church anymore because they had all been emptied at night. Now, among the kind of artifacts that you would expect to find from a Bronze Age civilization, including various tools of bronze, including earrings and rings and pottery and so forth, they found more than a few gigantic skeletal remains, even corpses, not just skeletal remains, but something more, almost like the mummified remains of giants. There are so many. It's so descriptive. It's so detailed what they discovered there. I'm trying to remember if there's more than three, but there's at least two individuals who we interviewed who worked at San Anastasia. And I'm trying to recall when. I want to say it was in the 80s, 1983, 1984, I believe, or 1985. Let's say early to mid 80s is when this was happening. These guys were, as I said, it was routine. They were finding the remains of giants. And these giants were between 9 and 12 feet tall. That was like the range, 9 and 12 feet tall. And it was so descriptive. One of the gentlemen, I'm trying to remember his name. I think his name was Giuseppe, but I don't recall exactly. It's in the film. It's in the film Holocaust of Giants. This gentleman had his wife working with him one day, and he said they were digging through the ruins, extracting artifacts, again, for the municipality. These aren't treasure hunters or tomb raiders. And they found a skull that was so large that he and his wife had to carry it together into the church. And he said he remembers it vividly. He said that the skull was this huge skull, obviously a human skull. We're not talking about a dinosaur. And it had the vertebrae still attached to it. So it's this big skull with the neck bone and backbone still attached to the skull. And he and his wife are carrying this thing into the church and placing it, laying it on the table. Also told me that one day they opened up a chamber inside of one of the towers in this archaeological site at Santa Anastasia. And when they opened the chamber, it was almost like it was hermetically sealed. They opened this chamber. They basically busted into it. And it's this large area, like one of those towers, one of those Nuragic towers. And inside of this tower, this chamber, there's this giant humanoid sitting there, just frozen in time. And there's a table, large table in front of him, and on the table is a massive goblet and a massive plate, and on the plate are oysters. So the giant died in the midst of eating these oysters, and he was very well preserved. And I'm trying to remember his name. I want to call him Giuseppe, but I'm not sure that that's his name. And this individual who's telling me this story said that he estimates that this guy had to have been 12 to 15 feet tall. And they took the body, and I don't know if that means that they took the body apart. I don't know if it was just a skeleton or if it was a corpse. This one he described more like a corpse, like it was preserved inside of this ruin, inside of this chamber. And they took the body and they laid it out on the table inside of the church with all of the artifacts that were with it. And they kept these guys kept repeating to me, and it was so strange to them that they would fill the church up with artifacts, and then the next morning they would arrive to continue the work, and the church was empty. And I said, well, who came? Who was coming and getting the artifacts? And sometimes, by the way, they would lay out. There was one instance where they found a few bodies together. They found a few, let's just assume these were skeletal remains, right, of giants. They laid them out in the courtyard in one occasion. And in that occasion, the individual who's telling me this told me the name of the person from the University of Cagliari, the capital in Sardinia, who personally came and inspected the remains of those giants while this individual was standing there. He gave me his name. And he told me who he was and that he worked at the University of Cagliari. Of course, this was back in the 80s, mid-80s, or early to mid-80s. And so we're not just talking about rumors here. I'm talking to guys who have held the bones in their hands. These aren't secondary stories. These aren't secondhand tales. These guys actually held the bones and the bodies, the mummified corpses of giants in their hands. This is what they were employed to do. And assumably, presumably, the people who employed them to do this knew that these guys were going to find the remains of giants. I mean, just the whole procedure and everything. It's just, and it obviously wasn't on the front page of any newspaper. These guys were told, by the way, not to talk about what they were finding at the Church of Santa Anastasia. Now, if you go to Sardinia today, and this is a scenario which is sadly coming to an end, but if you go to Sardinia today, and you can find some of the old timers who are willing to talk to you, and most of them are, if you go into their house and have some prosciutto and coffee with them or whatever, they'll tell you these stories, the old timers. So many of them have stories of discovering the bones of giants. Some of them are digging foundations for their houses, and as they're digging, they're unearthing. One lady was describing this massive skeletal hand she found in as they were digging in foundation for a basement in her house. They found this huge skeletal hand and wrist, and others will tell you that they found entire bodies of giants, entire skeletons of giants as they're plowing in the field. And they start to unearth bones, and they stop and they get out and look and see, because back then a lot of these guys weren't plowing with tractors. A lot of them were plowing with horses. Some of them with tractors, and they get out and look at the bones, because in Sardinia it was so common to unearth these bones And sometimes the bones had jewelry. Sometimes the bones, oftentimes actually, the bones had the fingers had rings on them. There was necklaces. The skeletons were adorned with necklaces, bracelets. And so when they would unearth these bones plowing their fields, their first thought wasn't, oh my God, a giant. They weren't thinking like that. These are very simple country folk in Sardinia. They're not thinking that way. They all know the stories of giants in Sardinia. They're very well aware that there were giants inhabiting that island, regardless of what the academics say, because of course the academics say that that's just fantasy. So it was so well known that these people would the first instinct would be to look for jewels, to look for rings, to look for necklaces, to look for artifacts that they could sell or keep. And what would happen when they would come across these bones and they would take off the artifacts, they'd slide the ring off of the bony finger or whatever, again, of giants, 9 to, let's say, 15 feet tall. They would take these artifacts home and then they would start to blab about it in town and start to boast that they found this gigantic ring or necklace. And what would happen? Somebody from the municipality, or in some cases, the Catholic Church, would show up at their door and confiscate everything they found. The bones, any kind of bones that they took. Sometimes people would take the craniums home because they were so large and amazing, but always they would take the artifacts, and those artifacts and the bones were always confiscated, aggressively confiscated from these people. I could just go on and on and on about story after story that I heard in Sardinia. Again, and the reason why I said that this situation is changing is because this was happening in the aftermath of World War II, in the post-World War II era, when there was a lot of construction going on in Sardinia in which they were upgrading the infrastructure. Sardinia has always been an agrarian island. It's mostly farmers, and you have a lot of olive orchards and things like this, and so it's a lot of farmers and a lot of let's say uneducated agrarian people lived in Sardinia, and so they were upgrading the infrastructure. They wanted to start modernizing the towns, modernizing certainly the main cities, and there's only a few of them. And it was primarily during this period of time. And also, the farmers were getting tractors. So the farmers after World War II started to get more advanced machinery to plow in their fields. So it was really during that period of time, let's say the late 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, that the preponderance of these bones were emerging from the soils in Sardinia as they were building the foundations and plowing the fields and so forth. And that's why today, if you go to Sardinia, the people who are my age will tell you, my grandfather told me stories about this, but you can still find the grandfather in some cases. You can still find the grandmother, right? And people say, well, why didn't they photograph it? Why didn't they film it? Well, we were talking about agrarian, poor people living in the 40s and 50s and 60s. They didn't have most of these people didn't have cameras back then. So the cover-up is very much recent in Sardinia, and that's another thing that makes that island very unique, very special, and in my mind, as I said, there's probably I would guess there's thousands of skeletons of the remains of, let's say, the Nephilim still buried beneath that soil.
Yeah, as you mentioned there, at one point, 30,000 Nuragic towers, at least 200 tombs of the giants still exist in Sardinia today. And we did visit Sant Anastasia. I found some photos online where you were talking. Right. I remember it. That village there still uses that well for water. They're still pumping water out of that well.
Yes,
3,400 years after it was dug. The other thing that connects Sardinia to ancient Canaan, and specifically even ancient Bashan in the Upper Galilee, which was a center of the dolmen building culture in the ancient Levant. Some 5,600 dolmens have been discovered on the Golan Heights, which was ancient Bashan, in Ugaritic Bathan, the place of the serpent, and about 1,100 around the valley through which the Jordan River flows between Mount Hermon and the Sea of Galilee, which Sharon and I believe was the Valley of the Shadow of Death, literal place. There are dolmens, a couple hundred dolmens on the island of Sardinia. Now, these are found all over the world, but again, you've got this connection there, and the age of some of these dolmens goes back to the same period of time when Gilgal Rephaim was being constructed, the Chalcolithic, the Copper Age, 4th millennium BC. According to the scholars who've excavated the ziggurat on Sardinia, Monte Ducote, they date the original part of that structure to about 4000 BC, using the common dates that they agree on. I remember when we were there, we looked at one flat slab and thought, well, maybe that was a sacrificial altar or something. And later at one of the other sites, I found a book on the dolmens of Sardinia. Of course, it's in Italian, so I can barely read it. But they pointed to that flat slab that was just to the right of Monte Ducote as you're looking at it as a dolmen. It's just mostly buried, so you don't see the vertical slabs of the trilithon construction there. So these dolmens, and especially that one or the ones around it that date back to, almost 6,000 years, connect to even way before Joshua walked this earth. There appears to have been a cultural and religious connection between ancient Canaan and the island of Sardinia.
Yes, and on the other side of that dolmen, you have the dolmen on. If you're looking straight at the dolmen at the stairway, you have the dolmen on the right, and on the other side is a monolith. So you have the
menhir.
You have the pyramid in the middle, the ziggurat in the middle. To the right of it is the dolmen. To the left of it is a monolith. So it's very intriguing. It's the only ziggurat that's been discovered so far in the Mediterranean, which, again,
what's it doing
there?
It's
a very weird place. The Sardinia is a very weird place.
The thing that really blew my mind, Tim, and this only became something that I realized during the research for my most recent book, is I was looking at the culture of the Hurrians and their oldest city, which was discovered only about 30 years ago by a husband and wife husband and wife team of archaeologists at UCLA. It's called Urkesh, and it's in northern Syria, very, very close to the northeast Syria, close to the Turkish border. The temple that they found there was very similar to temples excavated from that same period of history, 3500 BC or thereabouts, in what was Sumer at the time, the cities of and Uruk, but they didn't have that ziggurat type construction. They were simpler buildings, which means that the ziggurat on Sardinia is older than the oldest ziggurats that we know about in Sumer. So we're looking at a two-way transmission of ideas and
not just coming to the island of Sardinia, but flowing out from the island of Sardinia, influencing Mesopotamia.
Right. Which is really bizarre. There's a lot more cross-pollination.
Which makes me wonder if there is a pre-flood significance to that place, almost as if in the aftermath of the flood, somebody knew that location, the island of Sardinia, had a peculiar significance, and for that reason decided to occupy and to construct all of these different Cyclopean edifices, tombs, and the towers.
I'm going to have to go back and look at the dating of the later structure at Monte Ducote, because what we saw was the later construction, the original construction. They date to about 4000 BC, and that may have been a simpler form, but at the very least, it suggests that civilization there was tracking alongside the civilization of ancient Sumer.
Yes.
And it's only until,
right,
and it's only like the last 20 or 30 years that scholars have realized that, contrary to what was previously believed, that civilization began in what is now southeast Iraq, the Sumerians, and then moved north and west from there. There were urban centers that looked very Sumerian in their architecture at the same time in what is now northern Syria and southern Turkey, which from a biblical perspective makes sense. If they were coming south from the Caucasus Mountains, the mountains of Ararat, that makes perfect sense. But it also, is interesting that perhaps there were some Japhethites that went way west and settled in what is now Italy and the islands of Sardinia, Corsica, Malta, whatever. There's a lot more cross-pollination between what was ancient Canaan, the Levant, and the Western Mediterranean than we've been taught.
Yes, yes. And I think it's important to point out also that the Nuragi, these megalithic towers, are associated with the tombs of the giants. You often find uh, you often find tombs in the vicinity of the towers, or areas where they know that there was a tomb, which over the centuries they've taken the stones away and used them to build their houses and stuff. But areas where tombs have known, because as you mentioned, there were would you say 200 tombs, something like 200 tombs that
They know about.
that they know of that had been counted in Sardinia. There were probably many, many more.
Mm-hmm.
And this association between the tombs and the towers, considering that I believe that the tombs represent were utilized in the rite of incubation to commune with dead giants, perhaps in the underworld. I don't know. And what's really intriguing, what's this connection in my mind is the purpose of the towers. I'm not sure exactly what the purpose of those towers were, and it would seem obvious that stone towers are built for defense, and I'm sure that they were employed for defense. But 30,000 towers on one island for defense?
Yeah.
That doesn't make any sense. There's something else going on. And when I was in when we were in Sardinia together, my colleague Anselm P. Rambla was with us, and Anselm and I, we had this epiphany when we were walking around one of the Nuragic towers outside, and I can't remember the specific location, but one of the larger towers that we were touring, outside around these towers, there were like smaller little dwellings. Do you remember? There were like little smaller circular constructions. And inside of some of these constructions, you had, or where you could see that there was some sort of construction there, you had these basins, these stone basins. And we immediately, both of us immediately made a connection, myself and Anselm, to Machu Picchu and the mirror pools at Machu Picchu, which are stone basins, some of them carved right into the bedrock there, and which were filled with water. And these devices were used to take precise measurements to localize, let's say, to map particular stars. And what would happen is when the star was at its zenith directly over one of these pools, the outside of the pool, the ring around the water, the ring around the water would light up for just a second. It would flash. So it would form like a ring of light around the water, is what I'm trying to say, would flash just for a moment, just for a brief moment. And when that happened, they knew that the star was at its zenith directly above that mirror, that water mirror.
Mm-hmm.
And it appears to me that they were making those same kind of calculations at some of these Nuragi towers in Sardinia. So I think there's an astronomical relationship between the towers and the tombs, and it has to do with this veneration of the Nephilim, the cult of the giants. I don't know how, but certainly it has to do with communion with dead Nephilim, with dead Rephaim, and as you've discovered in your studies, communion with dead giants was not all that bizarre for Canaanites, was it?
No, it wasn't. And they passed the practice on to the Greeks and the Romans in the form of hero worship. Scholar Amar Anus wrote this back in 1999 in a paper called Were There Greek Rephaim, and showed that the term used by the poets Homer and Hesiod for the men of the Golden Age when Kronos ruled in heaven, in other words, the pre-flood demigods, derived from the same Semitic root word behind the word Rephaim. And it's astonishing. It was that same paper where he also pointed out that famous ancient Amorite tribe, the Tadanu, was the origin of the word Titan for the old gods of the Greeks that were banished to the netherworld. And again, we get back to this idea of gods in the underworld, sometimes on the far side of water, which is another interesting connection to the Sardinian wells that we'll have to talk about at more length at some other point. One of the other things that I found really interesting, and I didn't notice this when we visited El Ahwat, which is the site near Megiddo found by Adam Zertal back in 1992, where in his confusion, trying to find, what is this weird round architecture, which is nowhere else in Canaan. And then his Italian friend said, "Oh, we know about those. That's Sardinia." We saw this time, or at least I noticed this time, what we saw as we approached Monte Dakota. If you remember, as we walked on that path to get to this ziggurat, these like low stone walls with these looked like little doors in them.
That's right. Yeah.
Those are at El Ahwat also.
It's fascinating.
So I think the connection is clear. And this is something that you'll have an opportunity to see. And you, viewer, can join us for this adventure as we take you to site. I mean, I'll tell you, this is one of the sites where tours don't go, because it's the only sign that we saw in Israel, both trips, that's not in Hebrew, Arabic, and English. It's in Hebrew only, and it was kind of hanging off to one side, and you had to kind of push open a gate. It definitely off the beaten path. And a couple of the other sites that we'll visit don't have roads that go all the way to the site, like Gilgal Rephaim and the Serpent Mound of Bashan, Joshua's Altar. These are places that are a little bit hard to get to, but I'll tell you what, when you get there and you put your eyes on it and realize the spiritual significance of this, it makes it really worthwhile. And I'll tell you what, the tours that we've taken, you form friendships that last for years. We're still in touch with people that we met on our 2018, 2019 tours. There's a very active Facebook group that's continued from our 2023 tour, which is really amazing. We've got people, I know of at least two ladies who are coming back for their third tour in 2024. So we're looking forward to getting a chance to repay you and Jasmine for what you did for us, and being able to see the tombs of the giants, Monte Dakota, the Nuragic wells, or the sacred wells, rather, the Nuragic towers 5 years ago in Sardinia. Man, this is going to be something. Tim,
we're excited. We're excited. Thanks for inviting me on this tour. And I want to encourage all my followers, if you want to go to Israel with myself and Derek and Sharon Gilbert, come join us next year. I think it's the very end of March, is it not? March
31st through April 9th. And there's a 3-day optional extension to Jordan, which takes us over to Mount Nebo, this mountain of the Avarim, the phrase in Hebrew that the Canaanites applied to the spirits of the Rephaim. That's where Moses got his only look at the Holy Land. Petra, Wadi Rum, the Red Desert, where they filmed The Martian. In fact, more than one movie about Mars, because it looks like you're on the surface of Mars. Yeah. Well, exactly.
One of the things that I love, and my wife and I love about doing this kind of stuff with you and Sharon, is we not only do we learn a ton from you and Sharon. Always, we get an education every time we spend time with you guys, but we also have a lot of fun.
Yeah,
you guys, we always have a blast with you guys, and Sardinia was a lot of fun, and so it's educational, it's exciting, and I think it's just going to be a blast. I think it's just going to be a great time.
It absolutely will. It'll be like a rolling conference through the Holy Land as we visit these sites, and we can point out these battlegrounds, really ground zero in this long supernatural war, because this is where it all ends, at Israel. So find out more online, gilbertsinisrael.com. And again, Tim Alberino, our special guest, next spring as we go back to Israel for our 4th time. God willing, we'll keep doing this as long as we're healthy enough to do it. And Tim, we're just delighted that you and Jasmine will be joining us. Where do people follow your work to just keep up with what you're doing?
People can find me on YouTube, Timothy Alberino. They can find me on Twitter, Instagram, Timothy Alberino. As far as I know, I'm the only Timothy Alberino on social media. And my website, which needs to be updated, but my website, you can sign up for my mailing list, and I always send out notifications on my emailing list for the activities that are going on, the events, and so forth. So you can track with me there as well.
All right. There'll be links in the show notes below this video or audio, wherever you are watching or listening. Tim, look forward to seeing you next spring, if not sooner.
We can't wait. It's going to be fun.
Check the show notes below this program, whether you're watching or listening, wherever it is. I'll have a link to Tim's website and where you can get a copy of the book Birthright, which we highly recommend. And coming up, we will tell you how you can join Tim, Sharon, me, Tim's wife, Jasmine, she's really the brains of the outfit. On our tour of Israel next year, and as Hunter Biden's former business associates testify to Congress this week, the media tries to rewrite 3 years of reporting on the Hunter Biden scandals. Bless their pointy little heads. That is next as A View from the Bunker continues. Everyone learns differently, and that's why we write fiction.
It is. I find that some people love to read nonfiction, but there's something about fiction that psychologists say breaks that fourth wall. You no longer doubt what you're reading. You get so engrossed in the story that you learn. You can learn propaganda or you can learn God's truth.
Absolutely. So, yes, we write nonfiction books, but we are also using the gift of storytelling to try to teach spiritual warfare and spiritual truths. And during the months of August and September, we're offering all 10 of our novels at 20% off.
All 10 at 20% off? That's crazy.
That's right.
That is really, really a good deal. And now's the time if you want to buy gifts for birthdays or Christmas or whatever gift-giving season it is. It could even be Mother's Day next year. This is the time to save 20% on all of our fiction. And Derek's fiction is really, really good if you've never read it.
And Sharon's Red Wing Saga, 8 novels so far. She's hard at work on number 9. If you want to get engrossed in characters who are really grappling with the supernatural and trying to make sense of that world while teaching the divine counsel concepts that we try to communicate here, get involved in the Red Wing Saga. Again, all 8 of those novels, plus my 2 novels, The God Conspiracy and Iron Dragons, 20% off now only at our online store. That's gilberthouse.org/store. Driving the internet to think every Sunday evening from the beautiful Missouri Ozarks. This is A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. You'll find us online at VFTB.net. That's your basic acronym, View from the Bunker. Of course, you'll also find us on Roku, Apple TV, and the Gilbert House app, gilberthouse.org/app. On social media, you'll find us at Twitter at View from... Oh, wait a second. Now it is X. Yes, X, View from Bunker, or at Derek Gilbert. On Facebook, View from the Bunker is the page, and you'll also find us on Truth Social, Gab, MeWe, Getter, and Threads even. You'll find us there, Derek P. Gilbert, or at Derek Gilbert, depending on which we're talking about. Again, just please take a moment, if you would, and download our app to protect yourself against us being canceled. We will not be canceled from our own app. Well, if you're old like me and you remember 2019, yes, the time before Biden, before Biden, in December of 2019, almost a year before, we heard about the Hunter Biden laptop. Remember that story that got the New York Post canceled from social media for daring to report on this just before the 2020 presidential election? See, and I've got to watch myself here because if I talk too much about that, we'll wind up getting canceled again. But anyway, Joe Biden, while he was campaigning in Iowa, called a voter a liar, a bleep liar, and fat for daring to raise the subject of Hunter Biden's business dealings in Ukraine. Well, fast forward to this week, nearly 4 years later, and Hunter Biden's business dealings were front and center as his former business partner, Devin Archer, testified to Congress about the Biden's business dealings, specifically Burisma, again, that big Ukrainian natural gas company that hired Hunter Biden, put him on the board, paid him $80,000 a month, even though he had no experience in the energy industry and does not speak Ukrainian or Russian. What was the point? Well, if you guessed access, you are correct. On Monday, the Daily Mail this week. Daily Mail is a UK-based news organization and does better investigative journalism here inside the United States than any of the U.S. corporate media outlets. The Daily Mail also reported on the laptop back in 2020, and on Monday of this week, the Daily Mail revealed that Hunter Biden's real estate firm received a $40 million investment from a Russian oligarch named Yelena Baturina. She's a billionaire, It just happens to be the widow of the former mayor of Moscow. Baturina also wired $3.5 million to a company linked to Hunter Biden, and what her brother, Victor Baturin, tells the Daily Mail was, quote, a payment to enter the American market. Access. According to the story, in 2016, Baturina established an office here in the United States to oversee her investments here, and she invested $10 million in commercial buildings near the Barclays Center in Brooklyn. That's New York City. Well, these payments were flagged as suspicious activity by the U.S. Treasury Department. But we find from Devin Archer this week that President Joe Biden met with Baturina in Georgetown, Washington, D.C., before the $40 million investment, after which she was left off the Biden administration's sanctions list. Quid pro Joe. Now, what's really funny about this, though, funny because you have to laugh, otherwise you throw bricks at your television set, and that's not really productive, is the way the corporate media has been twisting itself into knots this week to pretend that they knew about this all along. The New York Times on Monday of this week, in reporting on Devin Archer's testimony to Congress, used this. This was the lead. The LEDE, the lead, the first sentence of the story. Quote, it has long been known that the elder Mr. Biden at times interacted with his son's business partners. Really? Because that's like 180 degrees different from what you've been telling us since the story about his laptop broke back in October of 2020. I mean, completely the opposite. This is really like a 3-stage pattern that plays itself out again and again when it comes to usually Democrat scandals that the media wants us to ignore. Stage 1, it's not happening. Never happened. You're a conspiracy theorist if you say it happened. And you should be banned from social media because you might, well, it's disinformation. Okay, stage 2, okay, it happened a little bit. Joe may have talked to one or two of these guys, but they didn't really know what they were doing. He had no knowledge whatsoever of Hunter's business dealings. Now, stage 3, after Devin Archer's testimony, oh yeah, Joe met with the business many times. Joe was in the room. In fact, Joe met with the widow of the former mayor of Moscow just before she gave $40 million to Hunter Biden and then was left off the New York Times. Now the story is everyone knows it happened. It's no big deal. And if you say it is, you're a conspiracy theorist. What's really funny, looking at this from a Christian perspective, is this. These people think they're winning. They think they're winning. And in the physical realm, they may well be. But just remember Psalm 2. The nations rage and imagine a vain thing, but he who sits in the heavens laughs. He holds them. The Lord holds them in derision. And a day comes when he will set his king, his anointed one, on his holy hill. So, New York Times, corporate media, bless your pointy little heads. Well, coming up, we've got a couple of things to tell you about, and obviously the big one is the Gilbert House Ministries 2024 Tour of Israel. We're going to be there between March 31st and April 9th. There's an optional 3-day extension over to Jordan, which we highly recommend. And as we mentioned, our special guest is Timothy Alberino. Tim and Jasmine joining us on the tour, and we hope you will as well, because we go places other tours do not, like Gilgal Rephaim, like El Ahwat, the fortress of Sisera that we talked about here, which links ancient Canaan to Sardinia, and some of these practices and cultic rituals related to the veneration of the giants. That and much more. We're working with Lipkin Tours to get a couple of other sites on the tour. We're trying to see if we can visit one called Kerbet Beteha. It means ruins of Bethsaida, which is like a smaller version of Gilgal Rephaim overlooking the Jordan River just 2 miles north of the Sea of Galilee, because that's where we believe Jesus was baptized and where he fed the 5,000. So some fascinating stuff coming up. You can find out more at gilbertsinisrael.com, gilbertsinisrael.com. Going to do one small conference later this year. This is a gathering in Valley City, North Dakota, just west of Fargo, between Fargo and Jamestown, called the Pitchfork and Hoe Gathering. And I'm looking forward to this because North Dakota is my mother's home state, but also because this gathering of Christian farmers, small farmers in North Dakota, South Dakota, western Minnesota, getting together to discuss, best practices, but also hearing the gospel. So we'll be talking about that, and you can find out more we'll have more details as we get closer to that date. But just put that on your calendar, October 27th and 28th of 2023. Thank you for taking an hour or so out of your time to watch or listen, as the case may be. And we appreciate if you get a spare moment leaving a review at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcast, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, wherever fine podcasts are sold. And if you could, just give us a thumbs up, a like on our Facebook page. Our announcer is the inimitable D.C. Good, and A View from the Bunker is a production of Gilbert House Ministries, released under Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 International License. We do this because we wrestle not against flesh and blood. I'm Derek Gilbert, and this is A View from the Bunker.